The problem with the three-tier system is it doesn't work in the 21st century. Let me go back to this idea of the tide house and the tavern. All those things that were true prior to Prohibition are not true today. That is to say, we have air conditioning, we have interstate travel, we have streaming internet, we have television, and we have radio. Nobody goes to the bar or the tavern these days to get a job. Nobody goes to the bar or the tavern these days to find out what the news is. No one goes to the bar or tavern to commune with their people. All of this happens online.
Welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market with me, Barbara Fitzgerald. In this show, we'll break down the complexities of selling wine in the US by discussing the relevant issues of today with experts from around the globe. Each episode serves up 3 key insights to help elevate your winery's presence in the US market. So grab a pen and paper and let's pave the way for your success in the US. Hello and welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Tom Wark to the show. Tom is a 30-year veteran of the wine industry. And as a marketing and public relations consultant, he's worked with dozens of wineries, retailers, trade associations, and wine service companies to help tell their story. Additionally, he's been the executive director of the National Association of Wine Retailers. He's probably best known for his prolific writing on the wine business, wine regulations, wine politics, and the intersection of wine and culture. Since 2004, he's published more than 4,000 posts, articles, and newsletters on these subjects, and currently writes at the Fermentation Substack. So welcome to the show, Tom. It's really great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you. I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, that's so great. Me too. And well, before we dive into today's discussion, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to work in the wine business?
That was a long time ago. Let me think. Okay, so I had just gotten my master's degree, planning to go on and get a PhD and spend the rest of my life in academia, teaching freshmen and whatnot about American history. But it turned out I did a little bit of lecturing while I was getting my master's, but more importantly, I started grading papers. And I noticed that freshmen often didn't include verbs in entire paragraphs. And I started marking them wrong, right? You can't write like this. And my professor told me, no, Tom. You can't mark them down on how they write. You have to try to discern what they know. And then I had this flash forward of 30 years of trying to discern what freshmen were trying to say. And I realized I don't want that life. So now I had to get a job, right? And so I assessed my skills and my talents, and it looked like marketing was a good idea. But then marketing is pretty big. So inside marketing, there was public relations. And then inside public relations, there were all sorts of public relations. There was high-tech PR, and there was book publishing, but there was wine PR too. Well, I'd spent a good deal of time going up to Napa and Sonoma, and that sounded good to me. And so someone made the mistake of giving me a job in a wine PR firm because I knew nothing about it, but it turned out I was actually pretty good at it. And so after 3 years of being in a PR firm, it took me that long to do the math. How much am I being paid versus how much are the clients that I'm servicing paying the firm? And that's when I decided I need to go out on my own and be a consultant, which I did. And so that was in 1993. And I guess I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, so you've been around for a little while, safe to say.
It is safe to say, yes.
In this episode, we'll talk to Tom more specifically about the really serious challenges the current U.S. 3-tier distribution system poses for small and mid-sized alcohol producers, and especially wineries. Also with history, you're really uniquely positioned to talk about these things. So our 3 key takeaways for today's masterclass are, and what we're really excited to learn from Tom are, first of all, the history of the 3-tier system and when and why it was built. Second, what are the challenges it's currently posing? And then third, what does reform to the 3-tier system look like? So let's go back to the beginning. Let's pull out your history teaching, dust off those boots. But could you briefly walk us through the history of the 3-tier alcohol distribution system and explain why it was initially established?
I'd be happy to. First, let's establish what the 3-tier system is. The 3-tier system is generally a system of alcohol regulation in place in most states. And it boils down to basically 2 points. The state will issue licenses with certain privileges to producers, the folks who make the wine, the wholesalers, the folks who distribute the wine, and the retailers, the folks that sell the wine. Now, in addition to that, the three-tier system is unique in that it mandates that a producer sell its products to a wholesaler in a state, and then it's only the wholesaler who can sell to the retailer. Now, one thing to take note of in all that is that the contours of the three-tier system do not encompass how our wine is sold. It encompasses how a wine is brought to retail in a given state. So that's the three-tier system: licensing, and then mandating that producers sell to wholesalers and wholesalers sell to retailers. And we've had this system since 1933 or 1934. When the 21st Amendment was passed that ended prohibition, regulators had to decide, well, how are we going to regulate all this alcohol that's going to be legal once again? And the primary focus of the regulator at that time was how to prevent a return to what was called the tied house system. The tied house system was a way of distributing alcohol prior to prohibition, and it lasted from like 1850 all the way up until 1919. And the way it basically worked was it mainly applied to brewers and distillers. The way it worked is a brewer in a city would set up a tavern with all the things they needed: fixtures, leases, et cetera, et cetera. They would give them all sorts of different things, and in return the tavern would only sell their brand of beer. Now, the more beer the tavern sold, the better the brewer did. And so there was a lot of pressure that was put on taverns to sell lots of beer. And so they instituted these really terrible, terrible policies like buy a bucket of beer, and literally they sold buckets of beer then. Buy a bucket of beer and get a free lunch, buy a bucket of beer and get a free dinner. Open 24/7, right? They might have prostitution in the back. They might have gambling in the back. I mean, it was an all-purpose bad thing, basically. But it's important to remember that at the time, in the early 20th century and late 18th century, we had just had a wave of immigration in the United States. A lot of Italians, a lot of Germans, a lot of Jews coming to the United States. And they tended to gather in urban areas. And at the time, there was no air conditioning, there was no television, there was no radio, there was no internet, there was no streaming services, there was no interstate travel. I mean, you'd have to get on a train, it would take ages. So basically, the center of your life was your community. And your community, it happened at the time, centered around the tavern. The tavern was critical, right? It's where you would go to get your news. It was where you would go to get a job. It was where you would go to organize politically and to organize political parties. It's where you went to commune with your people. But it also caused a lot of problems, right? With those terrible marketing tactics, families were broken up. There were drunks everywhere on the streets. It was bad. And a lot of what people saw led to support of prohibition. And so we got prohibition. In 1919, ended in 1933. But when they decided, how are we going to re regulate alcohol, the primary thing on their mind was to make sure this tied house system, this connection between the producer and the retailer or the tavern, no longer exists. So they decided we'll create a three-tier system where there's somebody between the producer and the retailer, so the producer can't have that kind of influence over the retailer. And that's how the three-tier system came into effect.
Interesting. And so, who did they look to help them decide also how they were going to move, alcohol around the state and around the country?
There are examples of former bootleggers who all of a sudden didn't want to be bootleggers anymore because bootlegging, there was no profit in bootlegging. Now the alcohol was going to be legal. But the one thing they knew how to do was the one thing they knew was logistics, right? It's not easy to get a case of Canadian whiskey across the lake into Wisconsin or into Michigan, right? But they knew how to do that and they knew how to move it around. So some of those people actually became distributors. That's not to say that today's wholesalers and distributors have anything to do with organized crime. I would never make such a.
Right. No, 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 no. But I have heard an outrageous stat that, something like every drink sold in Massachusetts or something, the Kennedy family makes like 7 cents still to this day off every drink sold or something like that.
No, I don't. I don't think that's the case. Although I can't confirm it. 7 cents a drink. Can you imagine? I don't think so.
Well, let's talk about where we are now, because obviously the alcohol industry has really evolved over time. And so what worked then isn't necessarily what's going to work now. So, what are some of the most significant challenges that the three-tier system is posing today?
Well, the problem with the three-tier system is it doesn't work in the 21st century. Let me go back to this idea of the tide house and the tavern. All those things that were true prior to prohibition are not true today. That is to say, we have air conditioning, we have interstate travel, we have streaming internet, we have television, and we have radio. Nobody goes to the bar or the tavern these days to get a job. Nobody goes to the bar or the tavern these days to find out what the news is. No one goes to the bar or tavern to commune with their people. All of this happens online. So it's unlikely that if the three-tier system didn't exist, that all of a sudden we'd have these tide houses all over the country and they'd be filling people up with buckets of beer and people would be lying around on the streets. The conditions that necessitated the three-tier system don't exist today. And so the three-tier system is necessary. And so then we have to ask ourselves, what provisions of the three-tier system are necessary today? Do we really need a wholesaler in between the producer or the importer for that matter and the retailer? I don't think we do. And the reason I don't think we do is because I know that as consumers go to their local stores and look on the shelves, they tend to see an array of wines that are produced by the largest companies in the world that take up at least 50% of the shelf space, if not more. And they have this other smaller section for maybe smaller wineries. And this presents a problem for producers, right? How do they get their wines on the shelves if the wholesaler won't represent them? And the number of wholesalers in the United States has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, just as the number of producers and importers have exploded over time. We now have three wholesalers in the United States that sell upwards of 50% of all wine in the United States.
Right. And in some states, isn't it as high as 90% in certain states that's their
It is, as a matter of fact. That's right.
it's really difficult then for our small mid-sized wineries. I mean, obviously so many of what is in Italy, but also so much of what is in most wine producing countries.
Absolutely. So, what I think we need today is a legal way for producers and importers and retailers to cut out the middleman, to not have to not be mandated to use the wholesaler. And that's what's necessary in order to give producers and importers a better chance of connecting with retailers and consumers. We also need expanded direct consumer shipping, not just for producers in the United States who have largely obtained it, but also for importers and for retailers. Retailers are particularly important. Let me go back to importers. It's always been a little bit shocking to me that over the past 20 years, importers have not asked for the right to ship direct to consumers. They're the natural equivalency of domestic producers, yet they've never asked, and their trade associations have never asked for the right to ship direct. So, in lieu of the importer shipping direct to consumers, which would be a boon for consumers as well as importers, if imported brands are going to reach more consumers beyond the local store shelf, they need retailers to be able to be shipping direct across the country. Right now, only 12 states and the District of Columbia allow out-of-state retailers to ship into their state. And remember, in the United States, it's only retailers who sell imported wines. So those are the two changes that we absolutely need to see happen. We need producers and importers to be able to sell directly to retailers and restaurants without using a wholesaler. And we need retailers and importers to be able to ship direct to the consumer. If that happened, we would see an explosion interest in wine in the United States. And we would see a great deal of innovation too.
So, not obviously, this poses a huge challenge for our producers, our wineries, but also you're saying, this produces a challenge in people even being able to engage with wine, period. Disbenefited by not being able to have the wider selection choice, but also just by not being invited into wine because it's so limited.
It's true. Kansas, for example, since it's the middle of the country, it serves as a perfect example. You can go to the Kansas ABC website and you can see how many wines are approved for sale in that state. And it's about 27,000. Now, that might seem like a lot. 27,000 wines are approved for distribution. Last year, 151,000 wines were approved for sale in the United States. And that doesn't count wines that were approved previous to 2023. That doesn't count all the rare and collectible back vintages of wines that you can find at specialty wine retailers and online auctions. There are literally every year upwards of 500,000 different kinds of wines available. Now, let's say you go to Sonoma County and you visit a Sonoma Valley winery, and it's one of those older wineries that's been around for about 40 or 50 years, and you're at the bar and you're tasting wine, and they talk to you about these great vintages that they produced in the past. Now, maybe they have a 2015 or a 2016 vintage available in addition to their current vintage. But wouldn't it be cool if you could taste something from 2000 or from 1995? Well, if it's legal for retailers to ship into your state, all you need to do is go to winebid.com, and you can find thousands of wines that are older than 2000, let alone newer than the year 2000, vintage 2000, that are not expensive, that you can have shipped to your home. But if retailers are not allowed to ship into your state, you don't have any access to those, because those will never show up on the store shelves that you visit, let alone the grocery stores. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of wines that are not available to Kansans and to most consumers in all but 12 states. That's a problem, because what if somebody's just getting into wine, right? And they've heard about and they've read about people tasting these older wines. How do they go about accessing those older wines? Well, they're not going to go down to Safeway and find a 1995 Napa Valley cab, are they? Well, they're out of luck. Well, maybe they forget about their interest and they move on to something else, like cannabis or cocktails or whatever it is. That's how the wine market is diminished by these regulations.
Yeah, definitely. So you already mentioned some reforms that we could specifically cutting out, the middleman and increasing accessibility from retailers and importers directly, but how might these be implemented? I mean, is it as simple as we cut out the middleman and then everyone takes care of it themselves? Or are there new regulations that need to be put in place? If you were writing the laws, what would you do?
I've actually written a few laws before and a few bills on this, but the problem that we have is politics, to be honest with you. If you think about the way I've described the three-tier system, there is a specific stakeholder who really values the three-tier system, and that is the wholesaler in the middle. Remember, by law in the three-tier system, producers have to sell to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler is the only one who can sell to the retailer. They want things to stay in place exactly the way they are. And in order to change things, you have to go to the legislature. You have to present them with the idea that, we ought to reform the three-tier system. But it turns out that every year, wholesalers in the United States donate tens of millions of dollars to state politicians. I'm not joking, tens of millions of dollars to state politicians, not the folks who go to Washington, D.C., but folks who work as lawmakers in the individual states. It's extraordinarily difficult to fight against that. And yet I spent the last 17 or so years doing that. And it can be a little bit frustrating, but we have our wins here and there. The only time, for example, a new direct shipping law is implemented in a state is when consumers in that state really make their voices heard. And so when we have a bill running in a different state, so for example, this year, we're going to run a bill in Washington and in New York State that will allow out-of-state retailers to ship consumers there. When we do that, we're going to activate as many consumers as we possibly can to contact their legislator, to go and testify. Without the consumer, the bill won't pass, because the lawmakers will simply lean on the folks who have already demonstrated their commitment to their view, and that is the wholesalers who have given them millions of dollars. So it's a political problem. The other way to sort of advance this agenda is through the courts. There are states where in-state retailers can ship to consumers in that state, but out-of-state retailers may not. Now, that should sound familiar to people who have sort of followed the courts in wine. In 2005, New York and Michigan both allowed their own wineries to ship to consumers in those states, but they didn't allow other wineries outside the state to ship to Michiganders and New Yorkers. And so they were sued, those two states. Case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The case was called Granholm v. Heald. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, no, 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 you can't do that. You can't allow your own wineries to ship to consumers in that state, but not allow the other wineries outside the state to do that. That's a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. That's a violation of the very reason we created the Constitution. And so after 2005, the winery to consumer direct shipping channel really started to open up. But retailers were not included in that decision. At least that's what some of the opponents of retailer shipping have said. And so instead of having almost all the states open for retailer to consumer shipping, we only have about 12 of them. And it turns out there are now 6 cases in federal court challenging state laws that ban out of state retailers from shipping. The hope is that we get one of those in front of the Supreme Court. And if we do, I'm very confident that we'll win. So that's the other way. Litigation will be a way to open up the states. Even if we do that, though, eventually we're going to need consumers to help us, because I just have to tell you how this works. We get a decision in the Supreme Court. And let's say the Supreme Court says, no, you can't bar out of state retailers from shipping. Well, the state has a choice at that point. They can either allow out of state retailers and in state retailers to ship, or they can shut down all retailer shipping from both in state and out of state retailers. And that's when consumers need to get loud, right? Because if consumers don't say anything when wholesalers try to advance that particular view of the law, they'll end up with no retailer shipping whatsoever.
I think I would wager that the average wine consumer has no idea really of these challenges that we as producers and retailers, et cetera, face. So how would you suggest that we really make them aware, even tell them to get loud enough to make a difference in their state?
Well, first of all, one of the things I do is I lobby. And in my role as a lobbyist, I'm also sort of in charge of ginning up public support for something. And one thing I know is you don't ask somebody to do something if there's not something for them to do. So it doesn't make much sense to ask consumers to tell your Illinois lawmakers to pass a law allowing retailer to consumer shipping in your state if there's not a bill in the legislature that they can vote for. So you have to be very selective when you ask consumers to do something. But when we do have a bill in a certain state, and when we do reach out either via the media, when retailers reach out with emails saying we need your help, when we create these pages where people can tell the lawmakers their views and then send it to them all with one click of a button, when we do all that, consumers respond because it's not a very difficult issue to explain. You're not allowed to have this Tuscan wine shipped to you because wholesalers in your state don't want you to, because that's competition for them. We want to change this. Please tell lawmakers you want to be able to get your Tuscan wine or your Friuli white, right? It's not a difficult story to tell. We also work the media on a regular basis. It turns out that the media as a whole support direct consumer shipping. I've never met a member of the media who doesn't, because when you explain to them the discrimination, the protectionism, they just don't understand. Why would you do that, right? We all live in a world where if I need an ivory button for a shirt that had the button ripped off, I can get it tomorrow, right? If I need a box of diapers delivered, I can get it. Whatever I need, I can get it immediately by going on the internet and ordering it from the right place. Not so with Italian wine.
In your opinion, what is the ideal balance between regulation and kind of innovation, bringing us into the 21st century? What kind of regulations should exist or not exist? We already know which ones shouldn't, but is there something that should?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when it's abused, alcohol can be dangerous for the people who abuse it and for some of the people around them. So it's always going to be the job of government to do what it can to dissuade people from over consuming and minors getting their hands on wine. So where shipping is concerned, we know how to do that, right? Put a big old sign on the side of the box that holds the wine that says, contains alcohol, must have a signature of somebody over 21 to receive it. You always have to have that. And you get a signature of an adult at the time of delivery. So that's pretty simple, right? We need to have those kind of regulations in place. We also need to have taxes paid. There was a time in this country when the vast majority of state and federal budgets were based on excise taxes. And excise taxes in every state are still crucial. So there has to be a way, whether we're talking about direct consumer shipping or whether we're talking about producers selling directly to retailers in other states, there has to be a way, an efficient way to collect excise taxes from those people. Those sorts of things are very, very important. And of course, I think it's reasonable to expect that a winery or a retailer shipping into another state will have to report how much wine they've sent to a state. So they have to remit reports and they have to expose themselves to the regulatory and legal jurisdiction of those states into which they want to sell wine. All of that makes sense to me. But the idea that a producer must use a wholesaler to get into another state to make sure that we don't have taverns on the corner producing drunk people. Well, it's a little bit absurd.
I have a thought. I don't know. And I'm curious what you think. But obviously, so we've talked about, the stakeholder of the wholesaler is probably has the most power from an economic standpoint at the moment and sway over legislators and what's happening with regulation. But if we were able to kind of state by state start to do away with them, with all of their experience in the movement and the transfer of alcohol, could they shift into like becoming a network of distribution for direct sales of wines? Or is that kind of outside of their?
No, I don't think that would happen at all. And it's funny when I talk about taking the wholesaler out of the middle of the transaction, I'm not talking about getting rid of wholesalers. Wholesalers are absolutely critical. Who else is going to move the boxes, right? Back in the day, I mean, wholesalers used to be extraordinarily good branders, right? They'd go to restaurants and retailers and they'd really talk up and they'd sell the producers in their portfolio. That doesn't happen so much anymore, right? But we need wholesalers. And even if a producer were able to sell directly to a retailer without going through a wholesaler, I don't see KJ doing that. I don't see Antonori doing that. It doesn't make any sense, right? What are they going to do? Buy their own fleet of trucks and drive it around the country? That's not going to happen. But a small Oregon producer who knows a restaurant in New York who just needs a couple of cases of the Reserve Pinot, well, heck, I can get a refrigerated FedEx truck to take it over there in a few days. I don't need a wholesaler. So wholesalers won't go away. Wholesalers will continue doing what they're doing now, and they're very, very good at moving boxes.
Well, that's, I think, an important call out too. It's not that we're calling for, anyone is calling for like the complete dissolution of an industry or a part of the industry. Like,
No,
yeah,
no,
but just a little bit more accessibility for the small guys
and for consumers,
and for the consumer. Absolutely. They're at the center of this.
absolutely.
As we start to kind of wind it down here, Tom, we like to ask our guests 3 questions to help our listeners better understand the US market and kind of cement the lessons of today's episode. So please try to answer these next questions in a couple sentences if you can. What is your number one tip for mastering the US wine market?
I think it's got to be developing multiple distribution channels. If you're going to use the 3-tier system, that's fantastic, but you might want to also develop direct to retail in those states where it's allowed. And you also want to develop a direct to consumer channel. That's going to be important too. You never know which way the winds are going to turn the wine market, and having multiple distribution channels is one way to hedge.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of keep yourself insulated from any extreme events. It leads me to think back to COVID and how challenging that was if you only had one way to sell your wine. Okay, number 2, what is something you would have told your younger professional self about selling wine in the US?
I would tell him, first of all, you should probably work on the weekends. I didn't like to work on weekends. I still don't. But no one and no entity is going to tell your brand story better than you are. Don't turn your brand and don't turn your brand story over to somebody else. And in today's world, you can tell it yourself too. It's so much easier now than it was in 1995 when I started out in this business. Tell your own story. Don't rely on anybody else.
Yeah, that's great advice. And like you said, so many avenues to get your message out there in today's world. Number 3, we all move around a lot in the wine industry. So, what is your favorite travel hack when doing work travel?
It's not so much a hack as it is a principle. Always plan on arriving everywhere early. When I go to the airport, if my plane leaves at, I don't know, 7 o'clock in the morning, okay, I know I'm going to have to board at 6:30, right? And then I know there's I got to park or I got to take an Uber and then I have to go through. So, okay, that's going to be an extra hour. After that, I always pad on about 45 minutes because I know something's going to go wrong, right? And no matter what we're talking about, the Uber doesn't show up, right, at your place or whatever it is, there's always a good chance you'll be late. And you don't have to be. And because you don't have to be late, when you are late to something, people are wondering, why didn't you plan to be here on time?
I like that hack because I play fast and loose. I'm like, oh, it takes 17 minutes to get there. I'll leave 17 and a half minutes. You never know. You never know what's coming up. Well, Tom, truly, thank you so much. This has been so helpful because, like I said, it's such a relevant issue for our small producers and important for them to hear this information and maybe even how they can do something about it when something pops up in their state or a state that they want to sell their wine in. How can our listeners connect with you specifically if they want any more insider information from you?
Well, if anybody ever wanted to contact me, all they would have to do is Google me. So I'm not going to hide my email address. It's everywhere. So it's Tom at Wark, W-A-R-K, communications.com. You can always reach me there if you have any questions or you want to chat. I publish fairly regularly on my Substack, and that is tomwark.substack.com. And then I'm also on X, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm on LinkedIn, and just do a search on Tom Wark and I'll pop up.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for all of these insights. It's been great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Masterclass US Wine Market. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest industry trends, remember to like, follow, and share our podcast. And if you find value in our conversations, please leave us a review to help others discover the show and grow our community. Stay tuned for new episodes every Monday. Until then, brindiamo il vostro successo.